good afternoon, or morning. Some places it's afternoon. I'm Jeff Goldberg, and 2 seconds ago I was told to introduce this panel. Actually, all I'm going to do is introduce my colleague, Jim Fallows. He is the greatest journalist in the history of journalism. He's won 17 Pulitzer Prizes, 14 Nobel Peace Prizes, and the Pritzker Prize, even though he's never built a thing in his life. In all seriousness, I want to turn this over to Jim. Jim is the stalwart of the Atlantic. He is the pillar of fire at the Atlantic, and he is one of the great reporters of our age, and he's also an excellent moderator, so you're in for a great show. Thank you.
Thanks very much to my colleague and friend Jeff Goldberg, who just did a wonderful job interviewing James Steinberg at the earlier session here at the tent. Thank you all for coming. I think this is going to be a very interesting session. Thanks to my fellow panel members. I'm going to say a little bit in context about the subject we're going to be discussing, how it fits into the rest of the topics we've been discussing over this last week at the Idea Festival, and the mix of opinions that we're likely to hear on the panel today and the plan for discussion. What strikes me over the week here in Aspen has been the leitmotif that's run through almost all the discussions, which is of big systems that are under stress. We're talking about the world financial system, we're talking about the media system, we're talking about the environmental. Would those of you on the side of the tent please either sit down or else step out of the tent? We've been talking about the environmental system. We've been talking about lots of, and our systems of communication, how the stresses on these systems are related, but we also have been talking in these various sessions about tangible ways in which we can reduce the stress, in which we can make these systems work better together, and on their own. And I think while the tone in some of these sessions has been, if not despondent-making, has been attention-getting, we also have had a lot of specific ideas about what we could do differently. The topic for today's panel, in a way, brings together everything we've been discussing this week, because we were talking about the challenge of feeding the world's billions. The world's population certainly is growing. No estimate challenges that. And not simply are there going to be more people and hungry people now who want to be fed, but people who are getting rich around the world and want to eat differently from the way they have in the past. They want to eat more meat. They have a higher intensity diet with more stress upon the land. This has been clear to me in the last 3 years I've been in China, where my wife and I have just returned. Two scenes that are vivid to me. One about a couple of months ago is in Ningxia Autonomous Region, which is where the Yellow River starts out as a great big river. It enters the province as a big river, and it leaves the province as a little trickle, because as it passes through the province, the water is drained out to have lots of crops in what would ordinarily be a desert. I've been to banquet after banquet in all areas of China, where on the one hand there's admirable parsimony about eating all parts of the food chain, the feet of the chicken and the duck of the bill of the duck and everything else, but also more and more demand, not simply for exotica like shark fin and other things of that sort, but simply more meat and more intense diet. So we're going to be discussing the ways in which the demands of the world's people for more food and better food can be met without intensifying all the other problems we've heard about in this conference, especially involving the world's agricultural basis, its environmental basis, and climate pressure. And we also have one additional feature of this panel, which is that many of you 2 nights ago were here for the screening of the movie Food, Inc., which I think many of you have seen. And the last third or so of that movie involves the Monsanto Corporation. It was not planned that Hugh Grant of Monsanto, the CEO, would be here after the screening of that movie, but that's how things have happened. And so he has graciously agreed to answer a couple of my questions about that movie, questions I think would be in everybody's mind, before we turn to the main business of the panel. So the plan, first I'll introduce the panelists who have exactly the right mix of backgrounds, and then begin the questioning. We have Hugh Grant, who is the chairman, president, and CEO of Monsanto, which is described in our program, a company that is 100% devoted to agriculture. He's been with them since 1981. You'll hear from him as he speaks that he is an actual Scots person. What the hidden benefit is, all the rest of us are actually Scottish too on the panel to one degree or another. So that can be the common theme you'll hear in this panel. I guess it's evident in different parts of our appearance. Henrietta may have the hair which indicates this, but so
Hugh don't have any.
Well, it's the whole varieties of Scottish appearance. So first we're going to hear from Hugh Grant. We're going to hear then from David Tilman, who is the Regents Professor and McKnight Presidential Chair in Ecology at the University of Minnesota. He's won countless awards and academic memberships for his work in ecology and biology, including, I believe he's probably the only person at Aspen right now to have received an award from the Emperor of Japan, the International Prize in Biology. I certainly received no awards from the Emperor of Japan when I was living there, so I am in awe of that. We're then going to hear from Jason Clay, who's the Senior Vice President for Markets of the World Wildlife Fund, and who has been particularly a leader in what you could think of as market-based ecology, market-based environmental protection. He's been a pioneer in many aspects of that. He was the founder of the rainforest marketing brand more than 20 years ago, I believe. He also has been both an author and a farmer in his own right. Now we're going to hear from Henrietta Fore, who is the chairman of Holzman International, has been the Undersecretary of State for Management for the last 4 years, the director of the U.S. Mint, a job I wanted when I was at one stage in my life. It sounds like an exciting job. Has worked in USAID, and it has an extensive corporate background. So let me start, and the plan is we're going to talk for a minute to Hugh Grant about the movie, and I'll put on the record a few of the questions I think many people who saw the movie might have. Then we're going to have a discussion among the panel about various aspects of how the science, the politics, the ecology of trying to expand the world's food supply, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end for questions from all of you. So that is the plan of action. My first question for you, Hugh Grant, about the movie Food, Inc. is, have you seen it? If so, what do you think? If not, why not?
If not, why not? So first of all, thanks for doing this, and to the team at Aspen, it's great to be here. So I haven't seen it. I've been traveling this week. It just started screening in St. Louis this week, so I've been out of town, and I never knew it was screening here. So it's a pity I missed it here. So I will catch it, but I was in Iowa this week with farmers, so I never saw it.
Yeah. I think people who've seen the movie would come away with two fundamental questions about your company. One of them directly about your company, one of them about your company and others too. One of the last third or so of the movie consists of interviews with farmers, relatively small farmers in the Midwest, who say they are being put out of business or put under tremendous pressure because of Monsanto's legal action against them for saving its patented seeds, as opposed, for replanting. So that is one question. What is your company's view on this situation? The other main theme of the movie, as applies not simply to your company, but to the packing industry and everything else, is a request for more transparency about modern food, more labeling, letting people into packing houses, letting people know where food is grown, making sure that all genetically modified foods are so labeled. And it says, while Monsanto is not the center of this indictment, it says that Monsanto resists having labels on its seeds as being genetically modified. On those 2 points, what's your answer?
Yeah, so I feel as if I've kind of vicariously lived through the movie, because everybody that I meet here, when you go to the movies and you say, "Don't tell me how it ends," well, I've heard how this one ends. Not well. So I look forward to catching up on it. So your two questions are suing farmers and labeling.
Yes.
So real fast, and then we'll get to feeding billions, and then I get a feeling we'll come back to the end of the movie at the end of the session. When you sue your customers in any business, it's not really a great business model. It's a lousy business model in farming, because every year farmers plant new seed. So they wake up in the springtime, they decide who they're going to reward with their business, and they plant seeds every spring. That's the business model. So suing them doesn't win popularity points. So let me just take it up a notch. We've been in business for about 12 years. We sell to about 3 million. We've sold to about 3 million farmers in the US. So 250,000 farmers a year times 12 years. So there's about 3 million farmers that we sell to in the US. And they come back every year. And we like that. So it's a repeat business, and it's a massively seasonal business. So of the 3 million farmers that have supported us since we put our shingle out and started, We've had arguments with 138. So if you take 138 and divide it by 3 million, that's the maths. And I think the movie showed 3 or 4 of that 138 over a decade. With those arguments, when we've settled with those growers, we take the money and we put it into scholarships. We try our best to put it into the county where they farmed, certainly into the state, and we put them into educational scholarships. It's not as if we're making money out of this, but we're enforcing our patents. But it's 138 out of 3 million. I was saying to somebody this morning, I'm guessing if you were running a lawn care company in Aspen, you would be in more litigation than 138 out of. So for the 99.9999% of growers that are buying this stuff, they buy it because it works. They're buying it because it's cheaper than the pesticides that they used to use, and they're buying it because they feel better about it, and they come back year after year. So that, I can go deeper in it, but that's kind of the gist of this. The bigger picture, so the movie never talked to the 3 million. The bigger picture, and I think it links into what we're going to talk about, is we sell to about 11 million farmers around the world, plus minus. 10 of the 11 million are smallholders. 10 of the 11 million are farming less than an acre a year. And they're buying this stuff, now because we're forcing them into it or holding their feet to a fire, they're buying this stuff because it works better, because it's cheaper than what they're doing today, and it has a scale neutrality that you don't often see in farming. Farming is usually about big. Labeling, Jim, just to do the super fast whiz through. Labeling's a gem. We could spend the rest of the time in the big top here talking about labeling. It runs and runs. Here's the gist of how I look at it in my time at Monsanto. Governments decide labeling law. They decide labeling architecture. Companies follow labeling law. In the US, the prime rule on labeling is nutritional and chemical equivalence. So if it's nutritionally the same and it's chemically the same and it isn't labeled. That's the general tenet in the US. Jump the Atlantic, it's totally different. C'est la vie. In Europe, labeling is totally different. And in the European labeling as it exists today, they draw a wiggly line. And the wiggly line ducks and dives around a whole bunch of stuff. So cheese, you know that cheese, especially the cheese with the blue veins in it that smells funny? Yogurt, especially the yogurt that's got these acidophilus things in it that's good for your stomach. Danish beer, the best beer on the planet. Cheese, yogurt, beer, all have genetically modified organisms in them. And they've been in there for a long time. But the labeling law ducks and dives around them. So their labeling has exclusions, and it's usually beer, yogurt, and cheese. If you have biotech products in Europe, they label them even when you can't find the stuff, and they call that derivative-based labeling. So you say, hey, this soybean oil has nothing in it. Yeah, but it came. It came from a biotech plant. But the cheese has it in it. Yeah, but that's one of the wiggles. So we play at the goalposts that exist around the world, and that one's a big subject. But those, so soon farmers, wiggly lines.
Thank you very, very much for that. We could spend this hour and many more hours going through all this, but it'd be a disservice to the real topic of the panel to do that. Thank you for answering those. And just one, you are fully capable of engaging these issues. Do you expect that you or other people from the company will engage with the film people as if the film gets more momentum?
Oh, I think the film is going to get more momentum. If Aspen's a thermometer.
This is the real America.
This is the real America. The revivalist tent in Aspen. I kind of wish we'd had our say on film because it's hard to convert people one tent meeting at a time. I can tell you for the 23,000 people at Monsanto, it hurts. Yeah. And it hurts, and maybe this is a segue into the bigger session, it hurts because there's this portrayal of Big Brother and dominance and, scary company and, where are they going to turn up next? I can tell you from the time I've been there, my whole focus has been on how do you share? How do you get this stuff out in a broader environment? How do you give it away? And we focused specifically on sub-Saharan Africa. So for a bunch of people that wake up, kind of like when I landed here and said, hey, the movie showed. I'm a lot more interested in the conversation that says, for companies like mine in the next 5 years, how do you share better? How do you improve what you're doing with NGOs and with governments? And how do you get technology into another 10 million smallholders' hands so they can start to feed themselves a wee bit better? That's kind of where that's the engagement, I think.
And that is the useful segue to the main topic of the panel. David Tilman, would you please give us the overview of how we should think about the problem of balancing the world's carrying capacity with the demands for food from the world's people?
Well, if you look at the last 20 or 30 years, with the Green Revolution, we had surpluses of grains all around the world. So we had governments paying farmers to grow less and so on. But we also had consumption going up around the world. And in the last decade or so, consumption is exceeding the rate of production such that we drove those surpluses down to basically zero in the last year. And when that happened, we saw large prices and spikes. And many of the poor people of the world actually don't grow their own food, they buy it. And if corn doubled and corn was 60% of their diet, which it often is, or rice in other countries, they had a huge increase in how much of their income they had to spend on foods. There was a problem. And this problem is really indicative of where we're going. So let me sort of paint a picture of the world as it is now and as it is likely to be 50 years from now. So there are 6.7 billion people on Earth right now. And that is heading toward, and looks like it will level off at, about 9.5 billion, about a 50% increase in population. So if nothing else changed, we would need 50% more food than we have right now. But in life, it's very rare that nothing else changes. And what else is changing is that incomes are going up around the world. If you look at the last 50-year trend in incomes in the developing nations, and project those rates out, which we've done with a differential equation model that really follows what seem to be the underlying forces of this, the people in those nations should have per capita constant buying power, real buying power incomes that are about 8 times higher than they are right now. They are going to become like we in the United States were for buying power about 20 years ago. They're going to be wealthy people. And then if you look at one other thing, you can ask, what is it that humans do when they get a little bit more money? When people are really poor, when they're earning $300 per capita per year up to about $3,000 or $4,000 per capita per year, they put their money, added money, into mainly 2 things: more energy and more food. The energy goes up incredibly, like from 300 to 3,000 goes up by a factor of 100, how much fossil energy they buy. The food, luckily, can't go up that much. We'd be blimps. But it actually goes up quite a bit. Let me see the numbers here. I don't want to get this wrong. So if you look at developing nations, look at how their diets have been changing with per capita income. Per capita consumption of nutritious crops, fruits, vegetables, grains of all sorts, should be double what it is now let me see, double what it is now by 1960. But the amount of meat they eat will be triple what it is right now. So we're going to have more people, but they'll be eating more food. And the net effect of this is that we're going to have to produce about 200% more food than we do right now. So if we grow 1 ton of wheat right now, we'll need 3 tons of wheat in the year 2060. This is what people are going to demand. As people become more wealthy, they want diets that are much more like our diets. Now, the United States is even off the chart of most of the developed nations. So I'm not using the United States. I'm looking at the 17 richest nations and what their diets are and how they've changed. But so we're heading toward a massive increase in global food demand. Now, how do we grow food? We grow it on land. Well, right now, the world has 8.5 billion hectares of land that is all usable for people. 5 billion hectares of that are used already for agriculture. So 5 out of 8.5 are already used for agriculture. The rest of the land is Antarctica, it's deserts, it's tundra, and so on. Now, of the 5 billion that we use, 1.5 billion is used intensively for row crops, corn, wheat, rice, and so on. And 3.5 billion hectares, and that's 3.5 times the size of the United States. That's how much land it is, 3.5 billion hectares, the whole United States. 3.5 billion hectares are used for grazing. So there can be some shifts from grazing land to farmland, which can help us. But there isn't enough land, if we just did things as we're doing it right now, for us to provide a 200% increase in the global food supply. There really is a major crunch. There are some big problems that we face. And those problems come in multiple forms. One is if we clear a lot of land, for instance, if we cleared the 2 billion hectares of land that is left on Earth that could be used for farmland, it's mainly in tropical rainforest, tropical savanna, and temperate grasslands. Clearing that land would, over the next 50 years, release as much greenhouse gas, that plus growing crops on it and livestock, would release as much greenhouse gas per year as we currently release from all the fossil fuels we burn on Earth. So it basically doubles the fossil fuel greenhouse gas problem. So we're trying to come up with more efficient buildings, more efficient cars. We still have a very greenhouse gas inefficient agriculture going on that would be growing very, very rapidly. So that's a big issue that we need to look at. Plus, if we tear down all those habitats, we lose their biological diversity. We lose these other species with which we share this planet and upon which we are highly dependent in the long term for the things which they give us. So if you, and I know this is all doom and gloom, and I wouldn't be up here if we were just gloom and doom, because I think there are solutions. I think that the people on this stage here have a variety of different solutions to these problems. And I will throw out one as a start, but there are lots of alternative ones, and there will never probably be any one that will be totally successful. But if you look at all the lands that are currently being farmed around the world, there's a large class of these lands that got a yield of about 1 ton of grain per hectare of land in 1960, and they're still getting 1 ton per hectare now. Those are in the least developed countries of the world. These are farmers with very small patches of land. They don't have the resources for irrigation, for fertilization. They don't have good seeds. If they had a crop, they couldn't get it to market. They're not doing it. And even the middle developed countries have yields that are about half of what they could be. So if we could have a program of international aid that could provide whatever it is needed, and their experts here can tell us what is needed. I'm not the expert on it. I can multiply the numbers and see if we do that, we can increase global food supply about 80%. And if yields keep going up as they have in the past, those two things would mean we won't need to cut down the 2 billion hectares of land. We actually could live on the land we have right now if we brought the rest of the world up to modern agriculture and had yields increase as they have been in the past. So.
Thank you. And before turning to Jason Clay, I want to just ask one point of factual clarification. I heard at a previous panel a figure which surprised me, and you can tell me whether I'm understanding it correctly or not, which is the world's agricultural systems in toto are net emitters of greenhouse gases as opposed to net sequesterers of carbon, which seems crazy if that's so. You'd think that growing crops would absorb carbon rather than emitting it. But is that true?
It is true. It's true for several reasons. First, the fertilizers that we apply, especially nitrogen, is converted, the nitrogen is applied as a chemical fertilizer, is converted by some microorganisms in soils when they are cool and wet into nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. I can't remember how many times more potent, but 290 times more potent than carbon dioxide. It's good to have diversity on stage to fill in the holes. So that's one issue. The other issue is that when you start farming a soil, that soil is filled with rich, deep organic matter. And as you farm it, you stir it up, and the net effect, if you look at farming, is in the first 50 years of farming, you release from that soil between 30 and 50% of the carbon that was stored in the soil. It's oxidized away basically by bacteria, and it becomes carbon dioxide. There is twice as much carbon in the soils of the Earth as there is in the whole atmosphere of the Earth. And so this is a major release of carbon just from the process of farming. So yes, plants are growing, they're taking up carbon, they're putting some in the soil, and it reaches a new equilibrium. But that new equilibrium that is reached in the soil has carbon content that is about 30 to 50% lower than when that land was first cleared. And so that effect adds a lot of carbon. Plus livestock belch out a lot of methane. If you add up all of what livestock and farming and so on does, it's about 3/4 of the greenhouse gas release that we get from burning fossil fuels. Agriculture right now is a very significant source of greenhouse gases. And frankly, it's the holy cow that is free of regulation all around the world.
Thank you. Am I right in thinking that belching out is a euphemism for what the cows do?
Yeah, it comes out of both ends, yes.
Yes.
50% the answer.
Yeah.
But actually, just to add to that, if you add deforestation and habitat conversion for agriculture on an annual basis, it exceeds any other greenhouse gas source on the planet. So this is the greenhouse gas issue. Right. In addition to being the food security issue, in addition to being political stability issue, this is the issue.
So let me use that as the transition to what you're saying. We've heard what could objectively be called a fairly discouraging prospect from David Tilman. How do we think about ways to begin approaching it? Jason.
Okay, so Just a couple of underscores of what David said first. So between 1960 and today, agriculture has increased into natural habitat at about 0.4% per year. Unfortunately, in the last 10 years, it has increased or encroached on natural habitat at about 0.6% per year. So that means that agriculture is gobbling up more land, even today, before we have 3 billion more people consuming 2 to 3 times as much food as we have producing today. Agriculture today accounts for 70% of all water used by humans. We need 20% more if we're going to produce the food that we're talking about in 2050 using the technologies we have today. 60% of the water that's used today is wasted by agriculture, so there is some give there. There's some ability to bring it in. But to put it very bluntly, if we're going to have a planet left that's worth living on, that has biodiversity, that has ecosystem functions, we've got to freeze the footprint of agriculture as it is today and produce 2 to 3 times as much as well. That's the challenge. How do we get there? We're going to get there the same way we're probably going to get there on greenhouse gases. There's not going to be a single silver bullet. There are going to be wedges. We've identified 7 or 8. I'll just briefly go through them because I think what is clear at the end of this is that to achieve what you've just described, we can't work on 1 or 2 of these wedges. We have to work on all of these wedges, and we have to succeed on these wedges. We can't just give it a good try. So the first wedge is genetics. We can't leave anything off the table, whether it's genetic engineering, whether it's land races, whether it's hybrids, whether it's genetic modification. We have got to look at what the genetic tools are available to us and see how they can be used for drought tolerance, how they can be used for increasing soil carbon, how they can be used for increasing nutrition, calories, productivity. But realize that I mentioned productivity last in a whole string of things. So genetics, there's a whole lot of work out there to be done. And it doesn't necessarily imply bringing part of one organism into another. Genetic engineering can be done within a genome. Better practices. Why is it that today farmers growing corn in Iowa produce 100 times more corn than farmers growing corn in other parts of the world? 100 times. Countries produce 10 to 20 times, on average, more of a crop than other countries do. There is a huge gap to be filled. In fact, the gap within a crop is often far greater, the variability, than between crops. And we need to focus much more on this issue. Technology. How do we improve irrigation? How do we get more crop per drop? How do we reduce harvest losses? How do we improve tillage? What kinds of new plants are we going to bring in that are tree crops that sequester carbon and provide food and increase employment and increase equity and increase income for poor? Waste. Globally, 20 to 30% of all the food that's grown is wasted. Part of it is at the farm, part of it's in the supply chain, and in the United States, about 40% of it is in the home. We throw away 40% of the food we buy. We've got to turn that around.
Can I how is that known?
How is that known?
Yeah.
It's done by surveys, and I mean this is one of those things that's sciencey, but we'll get more science as we move forward. People are beginning to ask the question, they're beginning to look at it, but it includes restaurant waste as well. So it's institutional waste. Now imagine, for example, if you had a handheld device that could test for E. coli, salmonella, coliform, various things that are in your kitchen or your restaurant or your grocery store so that you would know whether you needed to discard it or not. Because we throw away a lot of things because we fear it may be bad, but we don't know that it's bad. So this kind of technology could be really helpful. Overconsumption. 1 billion people on the planet consume more than they need to from the point of view of food. We know who we are. It's pretty straightforward. That's going to have to change. And it isn't just about getting more exercise, it's also about eating less. So those kinds of things. Degraded land. While we're encroaching on natural habitat, we're spitting out the backside land that is degraded, where we can't profitably grow crops anymore. We have new technology now. We need to go back and revisit that land and see if there aren't crops that can be grown on it. We think between 20 and 30% of future calories could be produced on land that's currently not even being used, because we have better technology today than we did when it was abandoned. And then the final issue is blocking patents. There's a lot of research that could be done if we could figure out a way to share intellectual property and to create joint ventures to allow some of the intellectual property that's locked up to be opened. Maybe 20 to 40% of global productivity could be enhanced through releasing, finding new ways to win-win ways, or ways to give away this technology or lease it or whatever. I'm not the expert on that, but this is a huge issue that's just sitting there that nobody's really aware of. So if we're going to freeze the footprint of agriculture, we need to work on each of these 7 things simultaneously.
Great. Thank you very much. Henrietta, you've been involved in a lot of the sort of cultural, political, organizational, economic framework in which a lot of these decisions are being made. What would you add to the way we should think about this problem and the responses to it?
If I could pick up on something that Jason just said that I think is very important. In my last job as the administrator of the United States Agency for International Development and the director of all U.S. foreign assistance, we saw a lot of the issues in this most recent food crisis last year in which we had to respond as a country. And we came up with a 2-year, $5 billion initiative, which will end at the end of this fiscal year. And one of the major parts to it, one of the 4 parts to it, was on science. Because it is important that the scientific discoveries out of our consultative group, our international laboratories, which are doing work, create more nutritious cassava, better work on all of the staple products. And this is a very important issue, and it's, I think, one of the keys to learn about. Well, my sense will follow up on both David and Jason, which is that this is a very important issue for the world, that of how to feed ourselves. As we look forward to the 9 billion people upon this planet by 2050, we currently have about 1 billion people that are in severe poverty and are very hungry. And this is something that has now worried the development professionals around the world. And we are most concerned about the most vulnerable population, which are children. Children under the age of 7 who have experienced more than 3 years of malnutrition. We feel that there are lifetime effects of this, and it is something that will be irreversible. So it's something that you should go away from today knowing that it's urgent, it's important, and it's also something that is solvable. So let me mention 3 areas. The first is that development and agriculture are very broad. You have to look at it as a whole, so that education is important. Are children working in their farms, or are they going to school? Women, an enormous segment of the farming population, how are they treated within a society? Politics. When you are in Afghanistan and the farmers are growing poppies, can you change it with a legitimate crop? It's a political issue. In Liberia used to be food self-sufficient. It is not. For the superb president, it is an economic issue. If you can feed your people and if you can export food. So agriculture and the issue that is before us today is entwined with the issues of water, of energy, of economic rights, of livelihoods. All of these issues are involved in political and economic development. The second point is that it is very difficult in the developing world to work when you are in the midst of conflict. The numbers are that in the countries that we are working in around the world for development and foreign assistance, 60% are in conflict at any time. When a country is in conflict, it is very difficult to move agricultural produce for farmers to be able to work. So whether the roads are blocked by militias or whether the young, healthy farmers are taken from the fields and given guns to go into the militias, it is difficult to move food. It is also difficult to get people back to the land. When we were in Uganda and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Lord's Resistance Army was beginning to stand down, we could see in the villages in Gulu, in northern Uganda, that the young men were returning but they had been in the militias for 20 years. They no longer knew how to farm. So we were trying to teach farming and agricultural techniques to reintegrate these individuals into society. The Lord's Resistance Army in the Democratic Republic of Congo had a different effect in Goma. This is where the beautiful forests of the Congo begin. And so the local authorities were saying, go in, cut down the trees, and start farming. But they didn't know how to farm. The soil is not ready for farming, and it is hurting the forests. So how you reintegrate after conflicts, during conflicts, is an enormous issue for the world as a whole as you look at these economies. And I will add into this one number for you to remember for livelihoods, which is in the development world, the International Youth Foundation has calculated that in the next 10 years, we need to create 1 billion new jobs. If we do not, you know that we will have continuing issues of unrest throughout the world, and this issue of how to create a livelihood is very much lined up with agriculture because 70 to 80% of many countries are involved in agriculture. And my last thought is that one of the things that we saw that really began to work is looking at the supply chains, and it's something that we might talk about more. But supply chains and public-private partnerships are a solution to this. This is doable for the world as a whole. So it is science. It is yields and extension services. It's water and how it is used. It's issues like roads and cold storage. When you're talking to the ministers in the developing world, between 30 and 70% is lost after it has left the farm because the roads are bumpy and they bruise the produce, or there's no cold storage, and so it either is ruined at a customs point or it's ruined at a market. We need ports, we need trade, we need finance, we need education. And all of that in that supply chain will mean that we can solve the problems before us.
Thank you. And I think we've seen how profound are the connections within this issue to everything else we've been discussing at this conference and in modern politics. So we've heard an academic, scientific framing of the question. We've heard about some of the NGO efforts that can be made. We've heard about the public policy responses. Tell us now about your company, which is in the business day by day of dealing with food supply, and what else we should know about this issue.
Yes, I won't dwell on the company. I'll talk about the how.
Good.
So the how. I totally agree with the what. And the frustration sometimes in these sessions and in many sessions around the world is people passionately describe the what, but when it gets to the how, it kind of fizzles. It kind of fizzles out. So some of the how, if you took every farm in America and you took every bushel of corn harvested in America last year and you divided one into the other, the average yield in the US last year was 153 bushels. So that's a great factoid for cocktail parties tonight.
That's per acre, per farm?
153 bushels per acre. Good. That was the average yield. If you go to Brazil, India, and Mexico, this is rough, but the average yield in Brazil, India, and Mexico in the same year was 50. Now, Brazil argues under WTO that they're an emerging economy. The secret's out. They've emerged. But they do 50 bushels an acre. If Brazil, India, and Mexico moved from 50 to 100, if they doubled and got to 2/3 of what the average curve was in America last year, you produce 4.25 billion brand new bushels of corn, which is roughly the same as all the corn that was globally traded in 2006-07. So there's one increment of global trade. If 3 countries could get their act together, and you sit there and the cynics and the skeptics say, yeah, this is another sales pitch for biotech. Forget biotech. It's better soil management. As David's point, why are you plowing this much soil every year when you plant this deep? So scratch the soil the same way you do when you're planting lettuce and put the seed into that top inch and start building 50 to 100 and find 4 billion new acres. Last June we committed on a 20-year path, which is unusual for companies, but we committed in a 20-year path to double yields. And we said that we think we can double yields in corn, soy, and cotton. And we think we can double yields in the same acre with 1/3 less stuff. And the stuff is nearly all water and fertilizer. And you heard the discussion on water and fertilizer. And I think there's the capacity to double yield over a 20-year time frame and use less water and less nitrogen. And that's sustainability is like religion and politics. Everybody's got their own brand, and everybody's passionate about their brand. So my definition of sustainability in agriculture is, how do you do more with less? It's easy to do more with more. That's kind of been the history. The trick in this is, how do you do more with less? And there's a brilliant business opportunity in that. So this isn't extraordinary altruism. I think the company that figures out how to do a bunch more with a bunch less, that's really cool. Then you fast forward and you say, so what does that mean for Africa? So just give you a really brief example, and it was kind of my piece of the how, because great technology alone isn't going to solve this. One company, that's why I said one company isn't going to figure it out. NGOs have failed spectacularly, and governments are lost in Africa. So somehow you have to bring people together who don't trust each other. You need to have disparate groups coming together. A year ago, and this was a bubble-up project from a bunch of young people inside Monsanto, a year ago, we started working on drought-tolerant corn. We will launch drought-tolerant corn in America in 2012. This is corn that sips instead of gulps. The question is, how long is it going to take for that technology to find its way to Africa? We donated all of those drought genes. We donated all of the seed. We donated breeders, and we donated the know-how. These are hard gifts because you have to do the whole thing. We set up a partnership with CIMMYT, where Norman Borlaug led the green revolution from in Mexico, and we found an African partner. And within that triangle, we are now working to bring drought-tolerant corn to Africa. The Gates Foundation kicked in. The Gates Foundation and Howard Buffett, who's a farmer in Decatur, kicked in $45 million. And they're funding the project. And it's an unusual group, but I'm optimistic. It's an unusual combination, an optimistic Scotsman. But I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because I think if you can bring these groups together and you can get funding, then we can do stuff. But the path that we're on at the moment, where everybody takes their best shot and everybody defends their corner, I think that's been pretty obvious. So my message on the how is, how do companies get more involved? How do they learn to let go? How do they learn to share? And how do governments wake up and NGOs coalesce? Because NGOs compete with each other more than they work together. And they all fight for their God, and they all fight for their brand of Christianity, but they don't know how to bring efforts together and work under one common umbrella. So that's my
Thank you.
25 cents.
And let me use that as a segue to a next round of questions, probably going in the reverse order back down the panel. Is we've heard on the one hand a very powerful description of the problem that we have to deal with. We've heard an impressively wide range of possible solutions, ranging from warfare in Africa to different levels of tilling to use of genetics, et cetera. Where is I'm interested in the sense of the point of intersection, the most promising next thing to do. For example, in public policy in the United States, if you talk about a food problem, people will 99% associate it with being overweight. That's the main thing they think of as the food problem for the world. Given the climate of public opinion in the United States, given the other things the U.S. has to deal with, what's the most promising next thing to do that will make a difference? And I'll start with you. We'll go back down the reverse order.
The most promising,
the top of the doing something list and I can give you a moment to think if you'd like, but,
okay.
the triage for actually getting people's political attention, public attention to saying, okay, here is the next step we can do, the most feasible next step.
So just top ahead, the last food crisis, so we had the food crisis, then we had an energy crisis, then we had a financial meltdown. The food crisis is still there, it just isn't on the front page anymore. It's still there. In the food crisis, 60% of the hungry people were farmers. Go figure. When a farmer can't feed, and it's usually herself, when a farmer can't feed herself, something's really broken. So my knee-jerk response would be, the US used to lead the world in this, and through leading the world, it had a reputation which was stellar. And they taught agricultural extension, and they taught the nuts and bolts of farming. The 60% of those farmers that are hungry are smart people. They're illiterate, They're smart people, and they need help and training. And I think if I was king for a day or president for a week, how USAID ties into this, how defense dollars move into this, because hungry, well-fed people don't pick up rifles. It's one of those weird truisms. So I would think, how do you start priming the pump and the US reasserting itself on leading the world, because Europe's lost in this, leading the world in basic agricultural extension and training people on the back to basics of farming. There's never, I think people are ready for that.
Very interesting. Thank you. Yes, Henrietta.
I couldn't agree more with you on the need for agricultural extension. It's one of the issues that we've seen a lot around the world, because as the laboratories and the science develops these excellent solutions and yield-producing solutions, we can't get them out. And you can see the effects of it, let's say, in Egypt, where there was an extension service. So the Lugar-Casey bill that's up on the Hill, that's one that people could come behind. Since Hugh has taken extension services, I'll toss in trade. Trading of agriculture can really help to distribute food. One of the issues that we confronted in this last agricultural crisis was that there was actually enough food on the continent of Africa, but we could not get it to the people who needed it because we didn't have the road systems, we didn't have the ports, we didn't have the ability for trade to move. And one of the sad things that happens when a crisis occurs and you need to send food in, you know that the United States sends more than half of the emergency food assistance around the world. But when we have to send food in, if we try to buy it locally, it can often take longer to ship from Mozambique into Mogadishu than it does to ship it from the United States. And that is the problem that trade can solve. Trade routes, customs, duties, so that countries can trade between each other.
Can I just add something?
Yes, sure.
I'm sorry, super fast. Ton of grain feeds a family of 6 in Africa for a year, plus minus. You move a ton of grain from somewhere in the world, usually the US, to a small village in Malawi, end to end, it's about $700. $4 corn, $700 to move a ton of grain to feed a family of 6 in a village in Malawi. If you grow that ton of grain, forget biotech, forget all the skepticism, all that. If you grow that ton of grain in that village in Malawi, it's about $70.
Wow.
It's about $70. You have to teach them. That's why I said, if I was king for a day, it's $70. I'm a business person. In business, you don't see 10-to-1 leverages. If I said to you, give me $1, I'll give you 10, that doesn't happen very often. Well, it's the kind of Madoff thing. It doesn't happen in real life. If you can take $70 and make it 700, if you can teach somebody to do that, that's the distribution thing. You can't keep dropping this out of airplanes, you know?
Plus it helps with the poverty reduction and the livelihood so that then people are able to look after themselves, which gives a dignity and a respect that is irreplaceable.
If I could just jump in. One of the, if you look at data, which I spend my life doing, the single best variable at predicting how much yield will come off a piece of land is the input that comes into it, the quality of the seed and the amount of and kind of fertilizer. And water. Depends where you are, and water, absolutely. But Malawi had a program which turned them from being a net food importer to an exporter in the last, 4 or 5 years, which basically involved giving subsidizing a little bag of fertilizer and a little bag of seed to individual farmers. And I think if you, that is your plan, basically. That's probably the $70, it might even be less than $70 to have it happen. Yeah. And that turned one country around. Now, if you can have that go on long enough that individual farmers can build capital and they can start buying full force with their leftover grain that they sell, they don't need for the family, you can start having the capital grow, you can have the infrastructure building there to meet that need, to meet the trade. And I think that's the path we have to be on. We have to take some of these initial steps. I think the World Bank, which was really against these policies before, has to turn around. And maybe they have now, I haven't heard. We have to let these farmers go from the same yields they had in 1960 to get closer to what they could have, 5 or so times more.
So yes, Jason, your next next proposal.
Just a few examples of how we get to 2050 of some projects that are already started. Mars has found out that they buy cocoa from farmers around the world, but mostly in West Africa. That's where most cocoa is produced these days. 20% of cocoa in a plantation produces 80% of the crop. Interesting. So Mars decided to invest $10 million in doing the genome of cocoa to find out why those 20% of the trees produce 4 times as much as the rest of the trees. Yeah. And they are a year away from isolating that information. They also found that for the 2 to 3 months during the dry period, if you provide water to the cocoa trees, they don't drop the pods. So you double production by having the timeliness of water, or by finding which cocoa trees are more drought resistant. Enhancing those qualities in a new variety of cocoa, they can produce 300 to 400% more cocoa on 40% of the land. Now, Mars is also interested as a company in buying carbon that's sequestered in those cocoa trees and in the shade trees, because they want to meet their carbon obligations globally, not through some informal book and claim system with somebody they've never met halfway around the world, but as a way to reinforce a supply chain they already have by buying something else, by buying bundles of values instead of one value and one value and one value. So that's one company, what one company is doing. In general, because of the price spikes recently you alluded to in the last 2 to 3 years, with China kicking in, with demand in Indonesia, India, Brazil, et cetera, kicking in, prices went through the roof. For companies in the food business, price isn't the issue. It's availability. If you don't have raw materials, you can't make a product, period. Coke's operations were shut down in parts of the world because they couldn't buy sugar to make their product. What's it worth to you to have that product? A lot. And so these supply chains are moving from transactions, spot market purchases, into transformational relationships, where the contracts are going 2, 3, and 4 years to supply 70 to 80% ahead of time of what Coke needs. And they'll lock in the quantities and the qualities and develop a negotiated mechanism for the price with the local producers. Well, if they're buying carbon in addition to the crop, then they've reduced their transaction cost by about 60% by doing all these things in one purchase. So this is the kind of future of supply chain management. Coke. If you ask Coke what their biggest asset is, it's not their logo. It's their distribution network. And what they have begun to realize is that they send a whole lot of trucks out full that come back empty. They've begun in Africa, in Ghana in particular, to backhaul product from small farmers that would otherwise rot. So in Ghana, 80% of pineapple and pineapple plantations was simply not harvested because there wasn't a market for it. So Coke began to put into place a juice processing facility locally and hauling back this product into the cities of West Africa, but also beginning to export it into Europe. Global economy has cut this about in half, but they had reduced the losses to, well, they had increased the harvest rate to about 80% of the pineapple that was grown. So these are other ways to begin to address this issue. But in general, I think we have to be really careful about just focusing on productivity and price. You've mentioned it. It's really about affordability. It's about assets. How do we grow the assets of the rural poor? Because every generation you divide up the land, and if you haven't increased the assets, you're not making the next generation any better off. In fact, they're probably worse off than the last generation. I think carbon is going to be one of the ways we begin to do that, to increase assets.
Thank you. And David, do you have another idea you'd like to add of the next
I know
thing to focus on?
I already added one, so I probably should not.
Good. Well, I'll ask the panel one more question. I invite you to come up to the microphones for questions while I'm posing this. At many of the climate change panels I've been to at this conference, there's been an assertion that the world's energy problems really can't be solved without some fundamental technological breakthrough. Now, let's set aside whether or not that's a true assertion. I'll assert that's what a lot of the energy panels have said. I think I'm hearing from all of you that that's not true of the food situation, that available technology, available changes in transport and everything else can solve these problems, can allow the food output to go up without entirely deforesting the planet, that it's a matter of applying known technology. Is that a correct inference?
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree with that.
I think it's the correct inference for how to feed people.
Yeah.
But modern agriculture is also an amazingly source of detrimental environmental impact. And we need food crops that need less nitrogen. They can give good yields, the same yields with less nitrogen, that need less pesticide input, for instance. They need less water. That kind of change in crops, from crops that were purely bred for yield and nothing else mattered, to crops that look at all of human needs, the need for food, the need for nutritious crop, but also need for a livable environment. Those are the next generation of crops we have to have. They're critically important.
Yes.
If I could add in, I think there are also some threats. Hugh mentioned that the food crisis hit. We all noticed it. Then came the energy and the financial. But the food crisis is still here. You're just not reading about it as much. There is a threat that we have not gotten the solution to, and it's in wheat and it's stem rust. And if you think about the number of societies that are based around a wheat diet, you realize that this is a problem. This is like an avian influenza vaccine or something else. We need to solve it as a world. The other one is to focus on some of the developments that actually can change whole swaths of countries. In Bangladesh, every year there are cyclones. What comes is salt water rushing and pouring over the rice paddies. The rice crops are not for saline water, they are for fresh water. So planting of saline water rice crops in a whole number of countries around the world would help all of those countries. So focus on the big issues. They're solvable. We can do it, but you have to pay attention. It's urgent. It's important.
But in a way, this makes this a more optimistic panel than some. And you're saying that much of the knowledge is there, the optimistic Scottish panel. Yes, over here, please identify yourself and have a terse question, please.
Thank you. My name is Kirill Goncharenko. It seems like this problem that's discussed at this panel and in many of the other panels, the large problems, the solution has to be sort of big business, NGOs, and government together. And you know, there's representatives of each up on that stage. And I'm just wondering, in the agriculture space, I mean, how is that going? Because I didn't see Food Inc. either, but clearly Monsanto did not come out really well in that film, from what I heard earlier. But it seems like Monsanto has to be part of the solution to this problem. And how can NGOs work with Monsantos? And then there's just...
Yeah.
Yes. So who would like to answer this? First, Henrietta.
Well, I could just say from a government point of view that we think it's a very powerful coupling, the academic communities, the nonprofits, business, and government. And we set upon tripling the number of public-private partnerships that we have by the end of this year.
I think it's a key question. I actually believe that is the question. And if you think about partnerships and relationships in your personal life, they're tough. You have to work at them, you know. And that's when you love somebody, you have to work at them. When you bring 3 or 4 people together and they don't know each other and they don't trust each other, it's super tough. And I don't think this is figured out. I don't think there's a template that says, here's one of the... I think this era is nascent in partnerships. I think there's some bright green shoots. We've donated the roadmap for rice. We donated a ton of germplasm for soybeans, and we've entered into this gigantic project with Gates. But it's the first lap in a marathon. It's early, early days. But I think if we meet here in 10 years' time, somebody said, hey, you see the movie? The winning companies in the next decade, the winning companies are the companies that are going to be able to form, maintain, and deliver meaningful relationships beyond their commercial enterprise. And I think that will become I think that becomes a societal prerequisite. I think that's something that we're going to have to figure out. But I don't think there's, I mean, you live in this world. I don't think anybody's done a stellar job yet.
Jason, yes.
I think we can't work on 1,000 issues. We can't possibly do justice to 100 things. So part of what we have to do sooner rather than later is develop for building consensus around the 4 or 6 or 8 key impacts that we can address, and understand where we are today and where we need to get to and begin to measure. And this has got to be science-based. We've got to leave the ideology and the assumptions at the door and look at the data, look at the holes in the data, look at the contradictory data, and figure out how to move forward. That's how we're going to make real progress. That's true with producers, with NGOs, with companies, et cetera.
Great, thanks. As a scaling matter, we have 15 minutes left, so just bear that in mind, questioners and responders. Yes?
Jason, just following up on what you said, people talk about, I fly in a plane so I can put in some money and offset my carbon footprint or whatever. But when I ask people what really happens, they say, well, they cover up little lakes in third world where the manure is. How do you go about, if you want to do things like this, making sure that you're actually getting the bang for your buck in terms of this lessening the carbon output?
Yeah, so how can individuals take some responsibility on these carbon issues?
Okay, so this has really interesting connections. 3 weeks ago, I was in Brazil at a meeting on soy, and we did back-of-the-envelope calculations to look at how Brazilian soy producers could actually also sell carbon. Because in Brazil, soy farmers in parts of the Amazon are not allowed to clear 80% of their farms. And if you take even a 10% kind of net present value for the carbon in those areas, they could sell 12 tons of carbon for every ton of soy that they sell. They will make more money selling carbon than selling soy. That's a real incentive for them to leave those forests. It's also a way that a European pork or poultry or dairy producer who buys the soy from Brazil can produce pork and poultry and dairy that's carbon neutral. Imagine the world where this kind of thing began to happen. And those companies in Europe buy the carbon the same time they buy the soy. Now, the details of this have got to be worked out. It's got to be peer-reviewed. It's got to be really buttoned down, because we can't have less than credible systems created around this that throw the whole thing in jeopardy. So it's got to be done right and conservative from the outset, I would say. But there are some real potential examples here.
Yes, over here.
Richard Green, I host a national radio show on Air America, and we've been promoting something along with Johns Hopkins University and now Sir Paul McCartney called Meatless Monday. And was just wondering your sense of the impact that it would have on the world if the world ate less meat with respect to the carbon dioxide emissions, the methane gas, and just feeding people.
Great. Yes, David?
Yeah. I've done calculations, I'm sure many of us have. Right now, over half of our grain is fed to livestock, which we then eat. Livestock is not very efficient at converting it. Chicken, it takes about 2.5 pounds of grain to give a pound of chicken. Pork is about double that. Beef depends on how it's grown. Grain-fed beef is maybe 10 to 1, but grass-fed beef is a wonderful thing. So there are incredible benefits to reducing meat consumption. And if instead of having the rest of the world be on a trajectory to eat meat like we were, if we were lowering our meat consumption and we were meeting at some intermediate level, it's easy to show in calculations that by eating more efficient food, we could reduce the need for future grain by 40%. That's even the same amount of meat being eaten, but just eating at the more efficient end, the tilapia and, let's say, poultry. And to actually cut down some of the protein, meat protein in your diet and eat vegetable protein instead, it has a much bigger impact. I think that's one solution we haven't talked about, and I think it's a very important solution. Human dietary change. The issue is how do we achieve it?
So definitely reduce consumption of meat, smaller portions. We don't need as much meat as we often eat. In the future, though, it's going to be the real battle around 2050 is going to be between poultry and tilapia and catfish. And catfish and tilapia are going to win because they're going to produce twice as much meat with half as much inputs. In fact, they're going to be producing a pound of flesh for less than a pound of feed. It's phenomenal what fish will do because they don't have to keep themselves standing upright. They just swim with buoyancy. So, I mean, these are the kinds of issues that should inform decisions about this. I'd just like to address one, what I would say, myth, and there's a lot of myths around agriculture that people hold near and dear, but one is that grass-fed beef is always better. When you look at the carbon footprint, because of the methane issue, a pound of grass-fed beef going all the way to finished product at 2 years of age has much more carbon embedded in it than a pound of cow-calf on grass and then a short rotation in a granary in a feeding operation.
If we factored in the true external costs, including the methane gas and the carbon footprint, into a McDonald's Big Mac, what would that really cost?
Actually, that's very interesting because the data that I've seen, and it'll be published in about a month or 6 weeks, is that culled dairy herds, which are mostly used for hamburger, actually have about a quarter as much greenhouse gases associated with them that's associated with the meat as grass-fed beef does. So that's McDonald's major source of hamburger in Europe, about half in the US. So actually McDonald's is probably much better than the average.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, over here.
Hi. When you think about supply and demand for agricultural products, how do you factor in non-market players like governments, i.e. China, acquiring supply and taking it out of the market potentially?
I think I'll take a brief swing. I'm sure David's got a view on this. That's one piece. I think the bigger piece, and it ties to, meatless Mondays and fishy Fridays. The other, the big, as I look 20 years out in agriculture, the macro effect in this is India, China, and Asia. There's some forecasts that say China will consume 50 to 60% of the world's soybeans in the next 20 years, and about 70+% of the world's cotton. So there's a piece of this. The boomers on this side of the world are graying, and as the boomers gray, we boast about eating less meat. Yeah, I eat meat once a month. I could live without meat. I'm a fish guy, The other side of the world is getting turned on to meat. So China's eating twice as much meat than they did in 1980. And they're now eating half the amount of meat that the US eats. And I think the point that David makes is, if that inflection works, it's going to be really hard to say to China, try a meatless Friday, because they're reaching for their first meat on Friday. And when they turn on, that's when this huge sucking sound starts, and where are we going to find that grain? So I'm less worried about the hoarding. I'm a lot more worried about how do you supply it. And in India, you look at poultry production. India's split between economic vegetarianism and religious vegetarianism. And the economic piece is flipping like crazy, and it's all poultry. And that poultry piece is starting that flywheel all over. So I'm less worried about the meatless Monday. I'm really concerned about what's going to happen on the other side of the planet.
We have 5 minutes to go. I'd like to suggest we get all the questions on the table, and I'll write them down. So we'll get a round robin of all the questions, and then we'll divvy them up among the panelists. Yes, sir.
Okay, Andor, I would like to challenge the five of you to work with three other rock stars, Bono, Warren Buffett, and Bill Gates. And
three other rock stars, you said, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And produce a movie with Jeff Skull which talks about this issue, challenges people, talks about the collaboration you are all working with, and provide a solution, which is put your information on a wiki for food so that we could all share things internationally. So it's not a question, but it's a challenge.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over here.
Love it.
You guys have talked about the importance of government and nonprofit organizations and companies, but do you believe that research institutions and universities around the world have an important role in both developing technology and educating people about what they should be doing?
Great, thank you.
My name is Fred Kent. I run a group called Project for Public Spaces, and one of our major programs is markets. And we have an international market program. And we just had a conference in San Francisco on these markets. And the Barcelona people were there who run the market. There are 43 markets that serve different neighborhoods in Barcelona. And they had a strike, a transportation strike. And within 2 or 3 days, all the supermarkets were emptied out. But the local markets were able to go right to their sources, which were within a very small region. And they were able to bring their produce and kept the shelves full for these 43 markets. We're seeing a massive increase in kind of local food production at very small scales coming into cities to activate those communities. And my daughter-in-law started in East New York, started a market, a farmer's market, but then all of a sudden all these people in that community started growing food and started selling in that market. So there's this human side that we're seeing coming into this whole arena.
Great.
That's a whole nother level.
Thank you. Great. Yes.
Nancy Birdsall, the Center for Global Development in Washington. I wanted to express a little pessimism in contrast, Jim Fallows, to your remark that the technologies are on the shelf. And I'd put it this way. There are really two problems. One is getting the prices right on water and carbon, and the other spillover issues that should be reflected in the price of food. And that we have this scarce resource of good public policy. And the second is the distributional issue that Henrietta referred to, that even if we got all the prices embedded in the food, I don't have much doubt that the technologies will develop, the private market will bring them to the fore, and the people who have middle income and rich status in the world will be doing just fine, as is the case today. But what are we going to do about the distributional issues that Henrietta raised? And again, the scarce public resource is a good public policy response at the global level.
Great.
So any comment from any of you?
Thank you. And last one to put on the table.
Yes, Bill Logier, and the U.S. has a petroleum reserve to ensure against supply disruption. And do you think it's advisable to have a grain reserve to ensure against a crop failure?
Great, thank you. So we have 5 issues on the table. The Rockstar Wiki challenge to get information up there, the role of research institutions, the role of local markets, pessimism about the scarce resource of public policy sanity, and a grain reserve. 1 minute apiece on any of these issues, starting with you, Hugh Grant. We have 4 minutes left.
And counting. Pessimism. As an optimist, let me talk about pessimism. I won't comment on policy. I'll tell you 2 stories super fast. I was in India last year, in southern India, dusty road, big tent, not as big as an Aspen tent, but a tent in Jalna in the middle of nowhere with a couple of hundred farmers there. Small farmers, 1 acre less, growing biotech cotton. So a lot of the insecticides go away, they grow biotech cotton. We get more Indian farmers growing biotech cotton than we have American. We get more acres of biotech in India cotton than we have in America. And I arrived in the room, they don't talk English, so it's a Scottish guy and an American company through a Hindi translator to Indian farmers. Fantastic. The first question, when is drought-tolerant cotton coming to India? And my optimism relative to transportation and distribution is these technologies skip. And there it's the democratization of technology. Their expectation is the day it arrives in the Mississippi Delta, I want it in Jalna. And I think that compression. Second fast story, village in Malawi. You go into the clearing in the middle of the village, big tree. All the kids are under the tree getting taught at school. My wife and I were there. I said, so why are the kids there? Why are they not in the brand new school? Why are they not in the brand new school, a 2-room schoolhouse? We're using the classrooms for storing the surplus corn. So there's no space for the extra harvest. So I think the pessimism is, as you correct one piece, you push it to another piece. The optimism is, these are resourceful people. If you can lend a hand, and that's my King for the Day thing, Jim. If you can lend them a hand, they're going to figure this out. We just need to get organized.
Great, thank you. Henrietta.
Well, quickly on the roads, because Nancy is really onto an important piece. There are quite a few people who've been talking about venture capital invest in infrastructure, particularly Africa, but it's really important. And to the young woman with the idea on the universities, when I was in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, there is a program for urban farmers that the local university has started. And it means that you teach people who are usually about 11 to 18 years old, who came from families with HIV/AIDS and may have HIV/AIDS, to grow vegetables using drip irrigation. And what it has taught is that there is more of an acceptance of products that are created by people with HIV/AIDS. The person who leads this is a fantastically exciting, inspiring young woman who is an agronomist. And so when you talk to the farmers, the young farmers who are growing these vegetables, they all want to be agronomists. They want to go to the university.
That's great. Thank you. Jason.
I would say that 90 to 95% of all the research that's being done on ag today is being done by farmers, not by universities, not by research institutes. If a research institute or university is not being asked by farmers or being willing to be paid by farmers to do something, they're not providing a viable service to them. So if you're in a university, figure out what you're doing. One of the first things I think they could do is document what the 90% of the farmers' research is actually doing. What's the business case for doing this or that? And then sell it to other farmers. I mean, get it moving faster. The role of farmers is not to educate other farmers, it's to improve their production. Somebody needs to take up that role. Universities could do it. Prices. Farming is probably the best example on the planet of treating everything as an externality and not included in the price that's really important. Water, biodiversity loss, carbon, etc. Well, now with carbon markets, we have the ability to bring that externality back into pricing. Water will probably be second. Biodiversity will be later, but eventually. Poverty alleviation may be another thing that is brought into the pricing. But we need to really look at this carefully, because I did an analysis of how much farmers were paid for the raw materials that went into a product, how much water they used to produce that product, and compared the two. And what I found is the cotton for T-shirts, the meat for hamburger, the milk for cheese, the sugar for Coke, those farmers didn't receive enough gross payment to pay a decent price for the water they used. And that would include all the inputs. Right. So if we don't start pricing these things right, we're not going to have them.
Thank you. David, last word from you.
I guess I like the movie idea. I really think that very few things ever happen in society until many people, members of society, understand it. Members of Congress, members of agencies, and so on, have to understand what the issues are. I think that a movie that was entertaining and informative, it has to be both, but just informative, it'll be asleep in the first 10 minutes, would be a fabulous thing to do. And I'd love to meet Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. So.
Great. So I've learned a tremendous amount from our panelists today. I hope you'll join me in thanking them for this wonderful discussion.